Right, Paul, we're here this morning in this very group setting to talk about, I think, a very personal issue, which is one of religion, and as it touches on the deeper philosophical sides of life as well, because religion, in essence, answers the big questions in life. That would be one of my theses. And I put it to you, as someone very skilled in understanding about religious context and the history of religion, I put it to you that originally the religion as we now know it came from individuals who found themselves outside the group and had to begin to solve some of the deeper, all problems really, many problems of their lives, but including the deep ones about the meaning of their life now that they've found themselves to some extent on their own, had to, or some of them anyway, had the capability of coming up with a new religious context, in that sense a new philosophical context, and that was of oneness, because they were an individual. The oneness of life became very apparent to them and central to their existence, and that had to be reflected in the philosophy / religion, and some of them came up with very lyrical, very well put ones, like Zoroaster, for instance, to the extent that actually got a lot of influence amongst perhaps other individuals. But the poetic oneness of the individual's answer, having been promulgated and supported, would inevitably be captured by the political side of life. And ever since the existence of the individual, there has been a dynamic between the individual as one and the social context, the very necessary social context of their life as many, which is the politic, and that religion has reflected that very dramatically throughout the ages. And often you could almost inevitably say the abuses that have been heaped upon religion are due to the group side of it. But is this really, is my thesis new? Is it old? Is it just accepted? I would be interested to know how you respond to that idea that I've just put forward.
Okay. I think it's absolutely the case that there is a kind of human tension between the individual and the group out of which he comes. And this isn't an issue addressed in different religions in different ways and different times. But in order to come back to your question, I think it's probably best to start with the modern world. And it's in the modern world that that there's been a revolution in terms of the ways in which individuals have become disembedded from communities. There is an estrangement from community that characterizes what was first the modern European experience and now the global modern experience. And again, in different places and in different times, in different ways. But the significant thing is that for all of us now, we have a degree increasingly across the globe of political power, of individual autonomy, of individual concern. Now, looking at this is a very interesting one. I'm going to sort of deconstruct it, go backwards. But the language of modern individualism is of sovereign individuals, of self-determination, of autonomy, of self-governingness. That's what autonomy is. And in that sense, the two things happen at the same time. And so the modern theories of individualism, which arise in the 17th century, are part of a new mythology, a new mythology that gives us on the one side the nation state and on the other the individual. And the nation state is likewise is to be single, is to be sovereign, is to be self-determining, and the move in the last, since the 17th century, the last 3 centuries, has been largely a drive for both individual autonomy and for state autonomy. And I see these as two sides of the same coin. And in that sense, they're both new mythologies. or at least they appear to be new mythologies. But when we look closely at the 17th century political language, we discover that it draws very heavily on a much older and theological discourse. So for argument's sake, if we look at Augustine, if we go back to the Church Father, the great Bishop of Hippo, we discover that his concern was likewise with the individual, but not with the state, but with the body of Christ. He was concerned at how an individual Christian, an individual soul, connects with deity and connects with the community. And one of the great insights of religion is that those two things, all religious traditions have mystical elements, but generally the connection with deity is the connection with community. And so if we go back to Augustine, we find much of the political language we now use of individual citizen and state, nation state, to be taken from that theological tradition. So we talk about political participation. Augustine talked about participatio, participating in not the political life, but in the divine life. And we talk about now the body politic, but he talked about Corpus Christi, the body of Christ, and described in the Mass, in the communion, the way in which the individual reconnected to the collective body. So we don't do it very often. We every 3 years in New Zealand, I think every 4 years in America, every 5 years in the UK, we have these elections. And these are where we recreate the body politic, a single body, and we learn to speak as a body. We have to mess around a lot with MMP negotiations, but this is our participation in collective life. Now, the Augustinian version of that is a very rather different one. It's a political. It's partaking in the life of Christ by becoming part of the body of Christ. If we look back again, we find that tradition, of the collective life, comes out of the biblical tradition, out of the Old Testament and the New Testament, which offers one very, very particular trajectory, which was which wasn't in accord with the norms of the times, either at the time of the Hebrew prophets, before and after the exile, the Babylonian exile, or later in what we now call the first century, but part of the Roman Empire in the Near East. And the philosophy that develops is exactly that same sort of opposition between a oneness of the individual and the oneness of God. And that gives credence, and that there's a parallel between the one God and the one individual. And we miss, I think, the kind of radicalness of this theology. The idea that every individual was of worth it still should be a radical idea, but we often lose it. We've become very familiar with the discourse, but perhaps not with the implications of this. But the idea that every individual stood equally before the law, and that every individual could in some way have their relationship with the deity, with God, with the celestial king as opposed to the earthly king, is itself a revolutionary notion. And it does create a particular form of individual. But the biblical tradition and the Augustinian tradition very much balance, or attempt to balance, the collective over the individual. And in that sense, they're very different than the modern world that we inhabit. There, the law and the social norms and conventions are constructed in order to embed the individual in a network where there's a deep conformity between theology, ideology, law, custom, and practice. And so, in that sense, there's a kind of framework in which individuals are both allowed allowed to flourish, but in terms of their, their group existence. The danger, the danger in the modern world is of utterly embedded individuals. And we have a quite new phenomenon in the modern world where one can become so estranged from one's religious and cultural tradition that one no longer has any ties or roots to one's family, one's language, one's place, one's cultural traditions, etc. And that's a very strange and new phenomenon that was, I don't think, even seen in ancient times as a danger.
I think you've raised a lot there, but I can only remember a certain number of things. But the thing I'd like to raise immediately is that the economic situation of life, it's not simply a psychological question of psychological health, the question of the individual and the group. It's also very much an economic question, because the group appeals to the ambitious person, in the sense that if they can gain some hegemony over the group, that gives more power and in the end more economic position. Now I'll take two examples there. Paul the Apostle initially persecuted the Christians tremendously, had an epiphany, and began then to Romanize what was a Jewish offshoot. He Romanized it and gave it tremendous political power through that Romanization, Paul being a Roman. And in fact, one could say that the Christian church, as we now know it, as a force within world history, began with Paul's organisation of the church along Roman lines, which gave it tremendous political oomph. And in that sense, if Christianity, to me, in a very clear way, is a very successful political movement. Putting aside the religion, Paul talked mainly about organisation. He politicised it, and it's through him, in many ways, the church survived as a political movement. And the church, as a political movement, is a power. It's an economic power, and it is also a vehicle for personal power, in the sense of someone can rise up within the Catholic Church in medieval times, Aquinas or other people who came from lowly beginnings, through their intellect can become tremendously influential within the church. So the church as a religion, to extract religion from its political context would be naive in the extreme, because I believe that a lot of very influential people within the religious history have been politicians, pure and simple, straight out. And others have been intellects. Now you mentioned, for instance, there have been intellectual individuals struggling with their individualness right through. And you mentioned Augustine of Hippo. Now, he started out as a philanderer and ended up a saint. He is very often quoted for his, I think, his understanding of the problems of the individual and how the individual can go back into the group and deny a lot of their lusts and their other aspects, and their the need for sex, power, money. He had all that, and then he turned away from it, and that's a very potent message to bring people in, especially individuals. But what about St. Anthony? He predates Augustine. He went out into the desert as did Jesus, and he denied again sexuality, money, and in fact he shunned people for many years, and around him accumulated other solo type people who now become called monks. It has nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with worldly power, nothing to do with organisation. It's purely the individual in their cell being revealed by their very loneliness, their cut-offness, their individualism, coming to an understanding of the deep religious principle which guides their life. These two elements both exist within the Christianity as a powerful movement. And in my opinion, there's a tremendous tension between them. And in the end, that's a very productive thing, because the cut-off, alienated individual has a place within religion as a monk, as a recluse, as a contemplative, as a meditative type of person, and they have a history of those sorts of people within the church, and they're over there, and they tend to be peaceful. They shun, St. Francis of Assisi, classic example again. Over here we have the popes, the organisers who make, who make the church an empire, nothing short of an empire. And yet people talk about Christianity as if it was, and Islam, and I'll get to Islam as well, as if it was some sort of, fairly understandable, unified movement.
I think that you've raised a huge range of different issues, and all sorts of issues about historical interpretation. I think some of your interpretations aren't correct, but let's not go there. Paul wasn't a Roman, but he was a Roman citizen, and I don't think that he actually exercised much political power. I think that came later. But let's not worry about the historical detail quite like that. It's certainly the case that the church is a quite unique institution. There isn't a Jewish equivalent. There isn't a Muslim equivalent. There isn't a Hindu equivalent or a Buddhist equivalent. So in terms of world religions, the organization of a kind of unified church institution, a church structure, is quite unusual. There are orders of Buddhist monks. There are all sorts of things that are somewhat like it, but they're very different. So in that sense, the church is a kind of one-off, and certainly that both in terms of some of its language and its political structure, it draws on the model of the Roman Imperium. So I think that is the case, and it's also the case that within that there are issues of political power and influence. There are issues of economic resources and their management, and also space for the kind of pieties and the mystical tradition, the monastic tradition, the desert and wilderness traditions, etc., etc. So I think in that sense you're absolutely right. It's not a single institution that's very easy to pin down. It has many dimensions across finally a global span and 18 or 17 centuries. So it's enormous in that way. But I think we shouldn't overstate. I think you've got a very modern idea of this tension between the individual and the institution. So that many of the many mystics were also abbots. They were, we would now think of them as sort of, corporate managers who were very effective in the world, but also spent a great deal of time concerned in developing their spiritual awareness, their spiritual practice, and that tension is, much more of a reading back than one that we always find. Although there clearly were individuals who, departed from the communities, but quite often they set up other communities and attracted followers to them, and the political dimension kind of reasserted itself. But I think a bigger vision, a way to see that without that tension, is even if you go back to the biblical framework. I mean, you have a kind of religion that develops around the temples in ancient Jerusalem, you know, and I mean, this is a priestly cult, a sacerdotal cult. These are elite families, educated families, who spend a great deal of their time advising monarchs, kings, and patriarchs how to do things, and their particular tradition, I mean, is a kind of spiritual politics. And it very rightly, as you say, has a powerful economic dimension too, but let's leave that aside just for the moment. Alongside those, you have a prophetic tradition, and you have people who have a direct communication, and who preach a message of social justice. Very often they spend a great deal of time telling the kings to be moral. They couldn't do this and get away with it in a purely political structure. They only get away with it because they form part of a broader whole. And they're much less concerned about national politics. They're much less concerned about what we would now think of as state politics. They're more concerned about the individual relationship with God. They're like Hosea 6:6, you know, I require from you not burnt offerings. That's what the priests and the temples and the politicos do. What I require from you is loving kindness. I mean, I want you to change internally. And their message was to everyone. I mean, to the lowly and to people with enormous political and economic clout. A third dimension that only again makes sense if you see it as a kind of social or cultural whole were people like the Nazarites, the Rechabites. These were guys who said, "Oh, Jerusalem is so corrupt. You know, you priests are corrupt. You prophets are corrupt. Let's go back to where we first found God." Where did we find him after we came out of Egypt and we were wandering in the desert? Where did we find God? At Mount Sinai. We found him in the wilderness. And we've only just gone, Pentecost, 50 days after they left Egypt. They arrive at Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up, and God, appears to them, etc., etc., etc. The Ten Commandments. The important thing about that is there's this tradition that runs through the biblical thing. As you say, it's Jesus who heads off St. Anthony. So there's a long desert tradition, and that's partly because it grew up in the Middle East and there's desert there, but it's also a tradition away from the city.
Yes.
The priestly religion, I mean, that dimension of religion is a city thing. You can't have a temple out in the countryside. It's about Jerusalem, it's about the city. The prophets are more mobile and more international. You get prophets who go into exile with you. You can have prophets in different places, but that much more greater individual concern, and they're much less concerned about the temple. And that third dimension are a very strange group of people. They live on locusts and honey. they live out of the mainstream, and they're kind of like a moral voice that yes, it's fine. The law is very clear. We're not just to have a one-on-one with God. You've got to build a moral society. But sometimes you forget the way. You forget what really matters. You forget that desert purity, if you like. And I'm not going to preach to you about that, but I'll be a living example. And so those three things, all of them, none of them can actually exist without the other. I mean, they came, I mean, this was the ancient Israelite package, if you like. But it only made sense because, I mean, the three were in some way symbiotic, if you like. I mean, that they live together. But those traditions, of course, run through history. But, of course, they get embraced, as you, I think, was suggested, under the umbrella of a single institution. Which it was never quite single, but in different ways in the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, and of course, I mean, later in different churches. But all those traditions are part of that biblical tradition, and of course have become part of our tradition. So we've always had people who've headed for the hills and the communes, and they can't do this economically, socially, culturally, or politically without there being a space that allows that. We've always had our prophetic voices who are saying the establishment's fine, but you've lost the moral plot.
Yes.
And you've allowed power to dominate. You're driven by economic goals rather than, broader social goals.
Well, I exactly there. I put it to you that eventually the imperium side, the political side, as it will in a non-religious political historical situation of the Roman Empire itself. After all, Christianity more or less rose with the Roman Empire and fell to a large extent with the Roman Empire. And it was the abbots, the mystical types in Ireland, the Outer Hebrides, who saved the Christian
tradition.
church. It was the mystical ones, the Mount Sinai's, the desert dweller, who saved it. Because when the political imperial part collapsed, they were the ones who, not being a part of that, having a tradition of surviving on their own anyway, carried the church. Not only carried the church, they carried a lot of the philosophical and writings from antiquity with them by recopying them in their lonely cells up there in Ireland. But that was something that was foisted on the church, the collapse of the Roman Empire. But what about the Reformation? Now there we have a church politically running rampant, owning a huge amount, being an imperial power within Europe, and alienating more and more individuals, both socially, psychically, and economically. Because the church was an economic force that locked up huge resources and everyone else is a peasant. And so the rising middle class within Europe couldn't possibly rise within the Catholic Church. It was an imperial power, wouldn't put up with that. So they had to rebel. So Luther was really was another example of my concluding thesis, that every now and then in history, every political power, that becomes too big and overblown must fall. And the same goes with the church. To the extent that it is a political power, it will rise up as a political power and it must fall. Either it falls because of events around it, or it is actually overthrown, as was the case with the Reformation in Northern Europe. And now we are at a period where the political side of the church has been used cynically by a lot of politicians, first of all in the United States, where politics and church are so close together it's indistinguishable, to be quite frank. And I put it to you that the church meditative types, the St. Anthony's, the ones who preach bring me justice and love, not money and power, these people should be standing up against the prevailing direction of the worldwide Christian movement, which is quite dominantly a political direction at this point in our history, and that the real church leader would be standing up against very powerful aspects within their own church if they were to do the right thing right now.
Okay, again, a huge sweep. I think it is true that the church became, in European history, a major institution. I don't think you should overstate its power. It very often was seen as there being two heads of power, political and sacral power, and the church was often very limited, very in conflict with secular orders. So I think it was never quite as all-embracingly powerful as you might be suggesting. But it's certainly the case that all sorts of things, but certainly the Reformation and the kind of Westphalian moment, as they call it, both utterly changed that particular matrix of power. One was alternative powers that with the development of Lutheranism and Calvinism, which very often was state rather than international powers. I mean, they were state-framed rather than much broader than that. The second thing was following the 30 Years' War and the kind of seemingly ceaseless conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, that finally a very powerful secular order developed that wished to put politics and religion and politics in rather separate boxes.
For very good reason that I believe, for the thesis that I just
Yeah,
said.
absolutely. And so the world's never quite been the same again. The post-Westphalian situation of religion was different depending on where you were. So you mentioned the United States. In the United States and France, the kind of the next stage of the Westphalian movement were revolutions, and the revolutions clearly. One of the results of the revolutions, not the only ones of course, was a very clear demarcation line, official demarcation line between religion and state. And that leads you to ban Muslim headscarves in France and not wear large crosses and worry about turbans in public places and public institutions. But it also created in the United States a formal separation. And so in those revolutionary states you get one model, you get a very different model with established churches like the Anglican Church in England or the Lutheran Church in the Scandinavian countries, etc., etc. So you get quite different models. But I think what you did have for the last period of time, at least at some sort of formal level, was a kind of privatization of religion. Religion ceased to have the kind of, within the modern secular nation state, the sorts of clout that it might have exerted in earlier times. And so even where you do get state churches, their area of activity is quite tightly circumscribed. So in that sense, the current world we live in, and you talked about the rise of the religious right in the United States. Of course, that's a very recent thing. I mean, it only dates from, we call them fundamentalists. Technically, they're kind of neo-fundamentalists in that they come out of a particular early 20th century tradition, but it's not really until the 1970s that we get the things like the moral majority with Jerry Falwell, who just died, and Pat Robertson, and the beginnings of a kind of organization of Christian believers into a voting political force. And why that happens is very complicated. Partly it's to do with what was seen as a kind of moral failure, the sexual permissiveness of the 1960s, all of those American tragedies that take you from Vietnam to Watergate, a kind of loss of faith and a kind of moral thing, and all sorts of issues, seemingly private issues or formally private issues that become public, like Wade and Roe and the abortion debate and the issues about homosexual rights, women's rights, etc., etc. And so you get a kind of resurgent Christianity which comes out of the private enclave sphere and makes a play for a larger political regime. But this also happens internationally. It's not just in America. So we have the rise of first the Mujahideen under a kind of Muslim banner taking on the USSR in Afghanistan. 78, 79 we have unthinkable, given the way we were taught, and I was educated to think about the inevitable domination of the secular order, that we would have an Islamic revolution in Iran. And so since the mid-70s our world has changed. And there are across the globe a series since then of what we might call religious regimes that operate not at a state level but at a global level. And they operate from international church organizations who engage in political activity in different parts of the world, evangelical and Pentecostal organizations whose campaigns of saving souls, particularly in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia, also have, I'm calling them religious regimes, they have a significant political dimension. In some parts of the world, like Nigeria, we have an Islamic, a Muslim regime at odds and competing very openly with the Christian regime. And so, given our incredibly wide-ranging talk, I mean, it's certainly the case that we've seen the rise of religious political power in terms of Christianity, its decline, but in the last 35 years we've seen a dramatic rise in the political profile of religion, and of course issues such as 9/11, flag this for us all. But religion is increasingly playing a significant role in international politics, and not just one religion, but a variety of them.
There's a recent development for the church and the Christianity and the state to be linked, but then lots of things are recent. It's a very fast-moving world now, and I think it's moved so fast that this is why I'm having this discussion, to try and catch up with where we're actually at, even though we're in it, which is the hardest thing of all to do. And what I see that we're in is that I would say since Reagan, in America anyway, that religion began to become Christianity, not just religion, Christianity became a political factor in political life. Now, anything that happens in the US since the Second World War was of global significance. That's, whether we like it or not, that's just the way it was. Anything that happened in the Soviet Union was as well for quite a while, and it's beginning to be again. But of recent times, for the last 20 years, it has been what happens in America that has had tremendous influence. And my idea is that, that we're building up to, is that we've accepted that political side of religion is one very important side which comes and goes, and addresses the worldly side of the world, and the mystical St. Anthony desert side, which in many ways is the origin. In fact, is the origin in all the other religions. I mean, Muhammad was a recluse, for God's sake. He spent all his time in a cave when he came up with his ideas. And all of the beginnings of all of these mass religions all began with a single reclusive individual. That's where they started. But the political side takes over, and now we have exactly that situation, where Christianity over the last 20-25 years in the United States has been profoundly influential in the global scene, and naturally there's a response from other political religions who feel threatened, not just economically, which they've felt so often by the post-war period in Africa, the Middle East, South America, and all. There has been tremendous neo-colonialization at purely the economic level going on there, and the response to that has been all of these revolutions and Vietnam and all of that. But over the last 20-25 years, they've also felt a religious imperialism. I think they have felt that, and with just cause, because the United States has linked so closely its prevailing Christian view of the world as being the view, and linked Christianity with democracy, to the point where, if it's going to be a good anything, it has to be democratic and it has to be Christian, basically. Now, last program was about democracy, and I basically linked that with the middle class. And I think the middle class need to have a resurgence to get democracy back within the West, and then allow middle classes to develop within the East, South America and all that, in order for democracy to have a bed to flourish in. But that's not the only problem. Now there's this huge problem of the religious and political link, which is seen as imperialistic, and I use that word not as a cliche. That's the word that people are using in the Middle East particularly, and Indonesia, and perhaps in China if it comes to that. And this is a very dangerous moment, and we could call it the Iraq moment, as opposed to the Westphalian moment. It's the Iraq moment, and religion has to be taken out of the global power play, because there's no winning. Religion will lose and humanity will lose if the political side of this or that religion is allowed to dominate in a global scene. What has to happen is that the political side of religion has to be taken out, and the individual, it is after all the age of the individual side of religion has to be reintroduced, as Luther did. And this will be a far more positive development for humanity and for the individuals as well.
I do agree with you that I think we are at a kind of critical juncture. You're beginning to sound as if that this was a kind of Huntingdon moment rather than a right one, a kind of clash of civilizations, as if Christian forces on the one side are lining up against Muslim forces on the other, and there's an inevitability about this clash. I think the truth is your call for taking religion out of politics is just not going to happen, and religion and politics are so heavily entwined, and so often, even if you're right about their origins, the divine voices heard by the different prophets, or the insights that they came to through their meditations, so often had political and social dimensions, and so they may have gone out to the forest, but they kept coming back in to do stuff, do stuff with the rest of it. But the truth about the interaction of religions over time is that yes, there have been flashpoints. But the much more significant and more profound insight is that for centuries, religions and cultures lived in harmony with each other. And the big history of humanity is about us living, alongside others and with those who are different from us. Where religions and cultures meet have often been flashpoints, but even those have been periodic interruptions rather than the norm. So I don't think there's anything inevitable about this clash. And I don't think that your idea of a kind of individual moment, a kind of Lutheran Reformation for Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus, I think that's another form of imperialism. But I do think you're right about, as I said, this critical moment, this critical juncture. And I do think that we're going to have to learn to live with others. And this is at every level. This is at a global level. The truth is that we're all not going to be Americans. We're all not going to be Christians, and we're going to have to struggle and negotiate differences. And this will change us and others in the process. The alternative to not coming to terms with each other is just too dire to contemplate. I mean, it is a clash of civilizations, but it's a clash of civilizations with too many people with very big nuclear weapons, and in the Middle East or in South Asia or globally. And so, in that sense, I mean, I think we are at a time when we have a tremendous amount of religious and cultural competency that we have to acquire in order to live with others. But this isn't just the Middle East, this isn't just South Asia, this just isn't, American imperialism. This is the reality on Auckland streets. This is the reality in our kids' classrooms. This is the reality in our workplaces. I teach at Victoria University. We have women wearing hijabs. We have incredible variety. We've just surveyed our first year students. We've got people from 40 countries in the first year class. I mean, it wasn't like that when I was an undergraduate.
No.
And so the world has undergone an amazing religious transformation. We've become, because of migration, because of the take-up of different faiths, and also a huge number of people, an unprecedented number of people, have no faith at all. So it isn't just a
a religious thing, it's also a religious and secular thing.
But that is a religious thing, having no faith at all. That's
Well,
a religious problem.
Well, actually, it's a very interesting issue. I was involved in this was a statement on national diversity, and the document went out for consultation. And somebody wrote in that he said being a self-proclaimed atheist is a bit like saying I don't play chess as my hobby. and I'm very sympathetic. There is a kind of strange asymmetry there.
Yeah.
But the truth is that the religious differences are real.
Yeah.
Some people do base their life on the Gospels and on what they understand to be Jesus' teaching. Some do it in terms of Hindu scriptures, some do it in terms of the Quran and the Hadith, some do it in terms of the Torah, and others do it in terms of a set of what we might call Renaissance and and humanistic principles.
Yes.
But we're going to these differences are not easily resolvable.
No.
They're not reducible to individual and collective. But we are going to learn to live with people. We're going to have to. And we're going to have to be aware that people are going to see the world differently from us.
You say that, but you see two things. One, I'm not just talking about a clash of civilizations. I'm actually saying there will be a clash of civilizations if we don't have a clash within civilization first. And that clash to me is pretty clear, but I'm often too clear for my own good. But it's pretty clearly that you said that that we have to accept differences. Now my point is that the mystic, the recluse, the individual, the contemplative type of person who doesn't play chess as a hobby, but who just thinks about it, what is the significance of chess? Should I play chess? No. Is there an alternative to chess? That is what we need. And we need that sort of thinking because that can encompass a wide range. Whereas the current religious potency that is linked with economic and political potency, and I focus on America, but it's not just there, that's the Christian side, that is incapable of doing exactly what you're advocating. Those religious right are exactly not going to accept anyone who doesn't play chess. If you don't play chess, you're the enemy. And we cannot accept you. We have to convert you or wipe you out, basically, or neutralize you. And this is my thing. The political side of religion is not able to accept difference. That's the whole nature of politics. It's our way or the highway. And so there has to be a resurgence against, of the mystical, more individualistic, accepting, wide-ranging type within Christianity against the political type.
I think that the point you raise is a significant one in the sense that, of course, the broad-minded, well-meaning people are open to difference, but quite willing to engage. I might think you're wrong, but the bottom line, Emmanuel Levinas, the Sorbonne philosopher, said that the first principle of dialogue is whatever you say, I won't kill you. and we haven't. The truth is, globally, we haven't got that far yet. That sounds like a joke, but it's not. And it's a serious, and I can't begin to have this conversation if I'm threatened, if there's no trust, or if there's such huge, the point you made before, asymmetries of resource allocation and levels of humiliation and poverty and disenfranchisement and alienation and marginality, that there isn't any basis. There's no we say we use the metaphor of come to the table, but some people haven't got a table. So in that sense, I think you're right. And those are the people, those are the kind of issues. The well-meaning people preaching to the converted, yeah?
Yeah.
And you're right, the people we're not going to reach are those who are closed. Those who, as you say, see a single way with no deviation, no alternative, and the one end of all of these religious systems are those who will, extremists who will entertain violence at that point. And my hope is, and I think this is a really large and crucial issue, my hope is that there are many more moderates than we think. But the strange thing is that the Muslim moderate and the Christian moderate and the Buddhist moderate and the secular moderate have not may not share the same worldview, but they have a tremendous pragmatic investment in stability, in peace, and nobody wants the extremists to rule.
Exactly.
And so,
exactly right.
I think that
And yet the extremist is ruling.
Well,
You see?
they aren't, but they're certainly power playing and class ruling. I don't think they're in charge in quite the way you think, because there is internal dispute, there are debates, when I was in the States last year, there were anti-marches in San Francisco. And it isn't all a simple hegemonic.
No, but at the
view.
moment in the Middle East, because of the fact that since Reagan and especially now with Bush, there is a dominance of that closed view that has stimulated and allowed for, because of its attack on the other religion, which is directly done. Maybe you can say it's done for economic reasons, for the oil, for the globe, but the effect is to promulgate the extremists. One extremist always brings out and promotes the extremism on the other side.
I'm sure, and I don't know which came first, and I think that's a real issue. But the truth is, as we sit here, in May, the end of May 2007, there is going to be a change in the American regime. The Bush era is coming to an end. The Blair era is coming to an end. There are a series of elections this year and next year that are very likely to change. I mean, they're not going to dramatically work like that, but there will be changes, and the changes will impact on the way America operates in the world. The changes may very well reduce and disenfranchise somewhat the religious right in the United States, which means it won't go away, but it will reform in different ways. And so I don't think I'm quite as bleak as you, but I do think it's serious. But I do think it's time to promote things like the United Nations. They've got a project they're on called the Alliance of Civilizations, which says, yep, look, we're not all the same, but there are things we can develop together.
I'll just put one question to you. Can you see anything now or in the immediate future around which, no matter what your religious persuasion or lack of it, the thinking individual, the middle class thinking individual that can unite with no matter where they live in the whole world? Is there a logos that can bring the human race together on the horizon or within sight?
Increasingly myself, I'm concerned about sustainability. There is a kind of eco-theology, an eco-Buddhology that's developed in Buddhism. There's a Hindu version, there's a Jewish version, there's a Christian version. This concern with our shared planet. It's not going to matter, having a clash of civilizations if there's no planet to have it on.
Oh, exactly.
So in that sense, I think there's going to be, but I think it's more than that. It's not just about sustainability. People are coming together about economic disparity. People are coming together about a range of issues which we're doing. Five issues seem central to us. We have an issue of education. We're going to have to learn about each other. Our levels of ignorance and create our intolerance. The second thing we're going to have to deal with is migration. As an issue, global issue. It's you feel this much more intensively when you're in Europe or the States than we do here, but only as far away as Australia. It's a huge issue. That's going to have to be addressed. We're going to have to deal with the issue of media and media representations and the kind of values media and advertising generate, the kind of world that's created, the knowledge and misinformation. We're beginning to recognize that the new media, the internet, etc., close to your heart, and the old media play an enormous role in shaping our view of the world, our understanding of our place in it, our understanding of what's significant and of how others are. And the fifth thing, if we've got five, no, I've only got four so far. The fourth thing is young people. who are beginning to find themselves in a situation where there are growing linkages across cultures, across religions, and a sharing of perspectives, and the idealism of youth that they can actually do a better job than we might have done. And lastly, I mean, is whatever you want to call it, sustainability, the green project. The awful truth is that 6.5 billion of us share the planet, and we're just beginning to acknowledge that this has a responsibility, individually, collectively, religiously, and this links us to others. So I'm only half bleak. You're a bit bleaker than me, but I think there are positive signs. But there's no room for slacking.
I think that's a good place to end.